The lanterns had only just been lit along the pier when Mirelle Vesper pressed herself into a stranger's arms and begged him to lie for her. "Please," she whispered, her breath quick against the wool of his coat. "Pretend to hug me." It was the autumn of 1863, and the whole of Brackenmere Hollow had gathered by the harbour for the Lantern Tide Festival. Every year, the fishermen set their little paper lamps upon the water and let the tide carry them out past the cliffs, so that the sea itself seemed to glitter with 1,000 small prayers. Mirelle had loved this night since she was a girl. She had not expected to spend it running. Behind her, cutting through the crowd, came Ambrose Thorne. He was the only son of the wealthiest merchant in the village, and he had spent the better part of an hour following her from stall to stall, growing louder and bolder with every cup of spiced wine. When she had refused his hand for the dance, he had laughed and said loud enough for others to hear that a girl who sold ribbons from a basket could hardly afford to be proud. So she had fled. And now, cornered at the end of the pier with nowhere left to run, she had seized upon the first gentleman, standing quietly apart from the noise, and thrown herself into his arms, as though she had known him all her life. The stranger did not flinch. He did not ask a single question. He simply lifted his arms and folded them around her, calm as a man greeting a sister returned from a long journey, and turned his shoulder to shield her from the crowd. "Take your time," he murmured. His voice was low and unhurried. "No one is looking at you now. They are looking at me." Mirelle pressed her face to his coat and breathed. She could hear his heart, steady and slow, and something in that steadiness reached into her own racing chest and calmed it. A moment later she heard Ambrose stop a few paces away. "Vesper," he called. "There you are. Come now. I only wished to talk." The stranger did not raise his voice. He merely turned his head and looked at Ambrose with the mild, patient expression of a man who has all the time in the world. "The lady is spoken for this evening," he said. "You will wish her a good night." There was nothing in the words that ought to have frightened a man like Ambrose Thorne. Yet something in the way they were spoken, quiet and certain and entirely without fear, made the merchant's son falter. He looked from the stranger's plain travelling coat to the calm grey eyes above it, and whatever he saw there made him think better of the argument. "A good night to you both," he muttered, and he was gone into the crowd. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Mirelle stepped back, her cheeks burning, and pressed a hand to her mouth. "Forgive me," she said. "I have never done anything so bold in all my life. I did not know where else to turn." The stranger inclined his head. In the lantern light she saw that he was perhaps 29, with a face that was handsome in a plain, unhurried way, more kind than proud. "You turned very well," he said, and the corner of his mouth lifted. "I have been shielded from worse men than that one, and never so gently." She laughed before she could stop herself. It surprised them both. "I am Mirelle," she said. "Mirelle Vesper. I sell ribbons at the harbour market, and pressed flowers when the season is kind." "Mirelle Vesper," he repeated softly, as though he were confirming a thing he already held rather than learning it new. She did not notice. The lanterns were floating out, and she was still trembling from her escape. "And you?" she asked. "Edward," he said, and offered nothing more. "Only Edward." Only Edward tonight. She ought to have thought that strange. But the lanterns were drifting toward the horizon, and the whole world smelled of salt and candle smoke, and she found she did not mind the mystery of him at all. They stood together at the rail and watched the lamps go out upon the black water. She told him, without quite meaning to, about her mother, who had taught her to stitch ribbons before the fever took her, and about the small room above the netmaker's shop where she lived alone, and about how she loved this festival most of all because, for one night, the poorest thing in the village, a scrap of paper and a stub of candle, could look like a star. He listened as though every word mattered. She would remember that, afterward, more than anything else. Not his face, but the way he listened, as if her small life were the only thing worth hearing in all the noise of the world. "You speak of your ribbons as though they were nothing," he said at last. "I think they are the finest work in this village." "You have not seen them." "I will," he said. When the last lantern had vanished from sight, she turned to thank him properly and found him watching her with a quiet, careful expression she did not understand. "You should go home, Miss Vesper," he said gently, "before your merchant's son finds his courage again." "Will I see you at the market?" she asked, and was ashamed of how much she hoped. "Perhaps," he said. "I find I have business in Brackenmere that may keep me a while." She did not know then that he had no business in Brackenmere at all. She did not know that he had come to the village 3 days before, with no plan but to see it, and that he would now find 100 reasons to stay. He came back on the very next market day, and he did a curious thing that she thought nothing of at the time. The harbour market was a crush of stalls and shouting and gulls, and a stranger to the village might have wandered its length twice before finding one small ribbon seller. Edward did not wander. He came down the crowded lane and turned to her stall as though he had walked to it 100 times, and stopped before her basket without once lifting his head to search for it. "Good morning," he said. "You found me quickly," she remarked, laughing. "Most people are lost in this market for an hour." Something crossed his face, there and gone. "I have a good sense of direction," he said. Before she could answer, old Mrs. Penhale, 3 stalls down, began to complain loudly to anyone who would listen that her son was at sea, and there was no one to carry her baskets up the cliff path anymore. Mirel watched the stranger set down his own affairs, cross to the widow, lift her heavy baskets onto his shoulder, and walk her all the way up the steep track to her cottage without once being asked. When he came down again, his fine coat was dusted with chalk, and his boots were ruined, and he looked entirely content. "You will spoil your clothes," Mirel told him. "They are only clothes," he said. He turned over a length of pale blue ribbon in his fingers. "You made these yourself?" "Every one." "Then they are worth more than my coat." She meant to laugh at the flattery, but he was not smiling in the way that men smiled when they wished a girl to be pleased. He was looking at the ribbon as though he truly believed it, and the look undid her more than any pretty speech could have. He bought the blue ribbon. He came back the next week and bought another, and the week after that. And slowly, without either of them naming it, he became a part of Brackenmere Hollow. He mended fishing nets on the harbour wall beside men 3 times his age, and if his knots were clumsy at first, he learned quickly and never once complained. He carried water for the alewife. He sat with the crippled lamplighter and asked him about the days when the old man had gone to sea. He learned the names of every fisherman's wife and every fisherman's child, and he remembered them. The village, which was slow to trust outsiders, decided within a month that whatever this quiet gentleman was, he was harmless and good, and they let him be. Mirel told herself she felt nothing but friendship. She told herself so on the mornings she caught herself watching the cliff path for his tall figure, and on the evenings he walked her home and remembered, without being reminded, that she had once mentioned she loved the smell of lavender, and pressed a small dried sprig of it into her hand. "You remembered," she said, staring at it. "You said your mother grew it," he answered simply. "I thought you might like some for the window." It was such a small thing. That was what frightened her. Rich men, she had learned, offered grand gifts they would never miss. This man offered only attention, and attention could not be bought back once it was given. One evening, as they sat on the harbour wall watching the boats come in, she asked him the question that had been circling her for weeks. "Where do you go," she said, "when you are not here? You vanish for days at a time, and then you appear again with the dust of the North Road on your boots." He was quiet a moment. "I have a house," he said, "some way north of here. A cold, large house, full of people who want things from me. I go back because I must. I come here because I wish to." "What sort of things do they want?" "Everything," he said, "and nothing that costs them anything to give." Then he smiled and turned the conversation gently away, and she let him, because she had learned that some men carry their burdens the way the sea carries its wrecks, deep down and out of sight. But not everyone in Brackenmere was content to let her be happy. Ambrose Thorne had not forgotten the peer. A man like that does not forget being made small in front of a crowd, and he had spent the autumn nursing the memory into something like hatred. He could not touch the stranger, who was too well liked now, so he turned instead to the thing Mirelle could not defend. She learned of it on a cold grey morning, when her landlord, the netmaker Tobias Cray, met her at the foot of the stairs with his cap in his hands and shame in his face. "I am sorry, girl," he said, "but Thorne holds the note on this shop. He has said I am to raise your rent or turn you out by the new year. I cannot cross him. My whole living is in his hands, and my wife's and my children's." Mirelle stood very still. The rent he named was more than twice what she could earn from ribbons in a good month, and the winter market was never good. "I understand," she said, because there was nothing else to say. "I will find the money, or I will find another room." But there was no other room, and there was no money, and Ambrose Thorne knew it. That was the whole of his cruelty. He did not need to touch her. He only needed to wait, and to let the winter do his work for him. She did not tell Edward. She was too proud, and she was afraid of what it would mean to be rescued twice by the same man. But he found her that evening on the harbour wall, sitting alone with her basket of unsold ribbons, and he sat down beside her without a word and waited until she was ready to speak. "It is Thorne," she said at last. "He means to have me out of my home by the new year. He has arranged it so I cannot pay." She laughed, but it came out broken. "He cannot make me care for him, so he will make me suffer instead. That is the whole shape of him." Edward was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was very low. "I could make this trouble go away," he said, "with a single letter tonight." She turned to look at him. There was something in his face she had never seen before, a kind of weariness, as though he carried a weight she could not guess at. "How?" she asked. "You mend nets and carry baskets. You are as poor as I am." He did not answer that. "Would you let me help you?" he said instead, "if I could." And Mirelle, who had been helped by him once already, who was tired and cold and afraid of the winter, felt her pride rise up hard within her. "No," she said. "You have given me lavender and bought my ribbons, and I will treasure that, but I will not be a woman who is passed from one man's charity to another. If I lose my home, I will lose it standing on my own feet. Do you understand me?" He looked at her for a long time. Then, to her surprise, he smiled, and it was a sad and tender thing. "I understand you better than you know," he said. "You cannot imagine how rare you are to refuse a thing you need because you will not be owned by it." He walked her home in silence. At her door he paused, and for one breathless moment she thought he might say something that would change everything. Instead, he only bowed his head. "Whatever happens," he said, "do not think you are alone in this. You have never once since I met you been alone." Then he was gone into the dark, and she went up to her cold room and pressed the sprig of lavender to her face and wept, and did not know why. The truth came to her 3 days later, and it came without mercy. She had walked to the coaching inn at the edge of the village to see whether there was any word of work in the next town. And there, in the inn-yard, stood a carriage such as Brackenmere Hollow had never seen. It was black and gleaming, drawn by 4 matched horses, and upon its door was painted a crest of silver and blue. 2 servants in fine livery stood beside it, and the innkeeper was bowing so low his nose near touched his knees. "His Grace was expected a fortnight past," one of the servants was saying. "The Dowager Duchess is most anxious. He cannot go on hiding himself in fishing villages like a common man. Northreach will not run itself." Morel stopped in the shadow of the doorway. "His Grace," the innkeeper stammered. "Yes, the Duke of Northreach, a great honour, a very great honour, though I confess I did not know he was among us." "Few do," said the servant grimly. "That is rather the trouble. Grey eyes, plain coat, answers to a Christian name and nothing more. If you should see him, you will send word at once." Grey eyes, plain coat, a Christian name and nothing more. Morel did not remember leaving the inn-yard. She did not remember the walk down to the harbour. She came back to herself, standing on the cliff path, with the wind tearing at her shawl, and the whole world had rearranged itself into a shape she could not bear to look at. Edward, Duke Edward, Arden Vale of Northreach, one of the highest men in the kingdom. He had mended her neighbour's nets. He had carried the widow's fish up the hill. He had come straight to her stall through a crowded market without once needing to look for it, because he had already known exactly where it stood. He had repeated her name that first night, as though he had said it to himself many times before ever hearing it from her lips, and he had let her believe he was a poor man. He had let her. She found him that evening on the harbour wall, in his ruined coat, as though he were still only Edward. He rose when he saw her face. "You have heard," he said. It was not a question. "You are the Duke of Northreach." Her voice shook. "You have been the Duke of Northreach this whole while. Every morning you mended nets beside men who could have been ruined for offending a duke, and you let them treat you as an equal. You let me. I told you of my dead mother. I refused your charity to keep my pride. And all the while I was refusing a kingdom, and you sat there and let me." Morel, was it a game? The word broke out of her. A great lord, grown bored of his balls, come down to the coast to see how the poor girl smiles? Shall you go home now and tell the fine ladies of Northreach about the ribbon seller who did not know she was talking to a duke? His face went white, and then it went hard, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw the man the whole kingdom saw, the man who could silence a room without raising his voice. "You will not say that to me," he said quietly. "Anyone else in the world but not you." "Why not?" "Because you are the only person in 7 years who did not know," he said. "And you are asking me to be sorry for it." The words hung in the cold air between them. Then slowly the hardness left him, and what remained underneath was so raw that she could hardly look at it. "You do not understand what it is," he said, "to be loved for a crest painted on a carriage door. From the time I was a boy, every smile turned upon me was a smile turned upon my title. Every woman my mother placed before me could recite my income to the shilling. I came to the coast because I could not breathe. I told no one my rank because for once, for one single autumn, I wished to know whether a person could care for the man and not the duke." He took a step toward her. "And then a frightened girl threw herself into my arms and begged me to lie for her, and did not know or care what I was. And I have not drawn an honest breath since that was not somehow about you. You refused my help to keep your feet beneath you. Do you know what that did to me? Every soul I have ever met would have taken the money and smiled. You would rather freeze. Morel, I did not hide from you to deceive you. I hid so that just once I might be chosen." She was crying now, and so she saw with astonishment was he, though he did not seem to know it. "It is too far," she whispered. "The distance between us. A duke and a girl who sells ribbons from a basket. Your mother, your kingdom. They will never let you. You know they will never let you." "Let me be plain," he said. "I am not asking their leave. I am asking yours." But she could not answer him. It was too much, too fast, the whole ground of her life pulled out from under her in a single afternoon. She shook her head, and she turned, and she walked away from him along the cliff path, and he did not follow. That was the cruelest kindness of all. He let her go, because he had already learned that she could not be held against her will. He was gone from Brackenmere Hollow the next morning. The great black carriage rolled north out of the village and did not return. Far to the north, the house of Northreach received its duke as it always did, with bows and candlelight and 100 small demands, and found him changed. The Dowager Duchess had arranged everything for his return. There were to be dinners, a hunt, a ball at the turning of the year, and the daughters of 3 good families brought down from the capital, so that her son might at last do his duty and marry as a duke ought to marry. She had planned it for months. She had not planned for him to refuse it all. "You will attend the Marsden ball," she told him, in the long gallery where the portraits of his fathers looked down in their painted furs. "It has been arranged. Lady Arabella has come 200 miles to see you." "Then I am sorry for her journey," Edward said. "I will not go." "You cannot bury yourself here like a hermit." "I am not burying myself here, madam. I buried myself here for 30 years. I have only just begun to dig myself out." She looked at him then as though he had spoken in a foreign tongue, and in a manner of speaking he had, for the words she heard were not the words of the son she had raised, the grave and dutiful boy who did as his title required. This man wore, when he thought no one was watching, an old travelling coat still dusted with chalk at the shoulder, a coat no duke had any business owning. He walked the cold grounds of Northreach in it in the failing light. He kept upon his writing table a single length of pale blue ribbon, and more than once his steward, Mr. Halloway, came upon him turning it over and over in his fingers as though it were the most valuable thing in the house. "Your Grace does not eat," Halloway observed one evening gently. "I am not hungry, Halloway." "Your Grace does not sleep." "No," Edward said, "I do not." He gave up the hunt. He gave up the dinners. He sent Lady Arabella and the other daughters home with every courtesy and no hope at all, and he shut himself in the library with the accounts of his estates, and the servants whispered that his Grace had left something of himself down on the southern coast, and did not know how to get it back. They were not wrong. He wrote her letters he did not send, 12 of them, and burned each one, because he had told her he would ask her leave and not press her. And a man who forces a woman to be loved is exactly the sort of man he had spent his whole life refusing to become. So he waited, in a great cold house he had never once thought of as a prison, until the autumn he learned what warmth was, and he did not know that the girl who had walked away from him was suffering a winter far crueler than his own. For in Brackenmere Hollow, the news that the humble gentleman had been a duke all along ran through the village like fire through dry gorse, and Ambrose Thorne saw his chance in it at once. He could not have Myrelle. But he could make certain that no one else thought well of her either. He went from tavern to tavern and from stall to stall, and he wore an expression of great sorrow while he did his work, which was the worst of it. "A pity about the Vesper girl," he would say, shaking his head. "A duke of all men, and she thought he meant to marry her, as if a lord of the realm would wed a girl who sells ribbons from a basket." He amused himself with her through the autumn and rolled away home the moment his mother called, and now she has neither her honest name nor her fine gentleman. A pity. I did try to warn her. It was a lie built cunningly upon the truth, and lies of that kind are the hardest to kill. The village had loved Myrelle, but the village was poor, and it was easier to believe a girl had reached above herself and been shamed for it than to believe that a duke had truly loved one of their own. The fishwives grew cool to her. Mothers drew their daughters aside as if her ill fortune might be catching. Her ribbons sat unsold in the basket day after day, for who would buy a bright ribbon from a girl the whole village was whispering about? And when she was low enough, when the cold had crept fully into her small room, and her basket had gone a full week without a single sale, Ambrose came to her himself. He found her at her stall in the grey afternoon, and he did not gloat, which frightened her more than gloating would have. He was gentle, he was reasonable. That was his cruelty now. "You see how it is," he said softly. "They have turned from you. Your duke will not come back, Mirel. Men like that do not come back. But I am here. I have always been here. Marry me, and all this whispering stops in a single day. You will be a merchant's wife, respectable, warm, fed. Your Tobias Cray keeps his shop. The whole village smiles at you again by Sunday. One word from you, and I make it so." She looked at him for a long moment. She was cold, and she was tired, and she was more alone than she had ever been in her life, and he was offering her the whole of what she had lost, wrapped in a single word. "No," she said. His gentle face did not change at once. "Think carefully. There will not be a second offer." "I do not need to think," she said. "I would rather sell one ribbon a month on my own feet than every ribbon in the world on yours. I told a duke the same thing when I did not know he was a duke, and I will tell you the same now that I know exactly what you are. The answer is no, Ambrose. It will always be no." Then his gentleness fell away, and she saw the whole of him at last. "You will regret it," he said very quietly, and he walked away. And within the week the rent came due, and she could not pay it. And Tobias Cray came to her with his cap in his hands and tears in his eyes, and told her she must be out by the new year, for Thorn had given him no choice at all. She began quietly to pack the small room above the netmaker's shop. She stitched her ribbons by candlelight and waited for the new year that would put her out into the cold, and she told herself that a poor girl had no business grieving over a duke. Then, a week before the new year, the storm came. It came out of the northeast in the black of night, the worst storm the coast had seen in 20 years, and it caught 3 fishing boats still out upon the water. All night the village stood on the harbour wall with lanterns watching the dark, and the wind tore the words from their mouths, and the rain came sideways off the sea. By dawn, 2 of the boats had struggled home, half swamped, their crews clinging to the rails. The 3rd had not come home at all. 6 men were lost to the sea, and Mrs. Penhale's son, who had carried his mother's baskets before a stranger ever did, was among them. The whole of Brackenmere Hollow was plunged into a grief so deep it seemed the sun would never rise upon it again, and in that grief the village forgot its whispering. Mirel was on the harbour wall all that terrible night with the rest of them, holding a lantern with hands blue from cold, and when the news of the 3rd boat came in, she was the first to Mrs. Penhale's side, and she did not leave it. Grief has a way of showing a village who its true daughters are. Ambrose Thorn was nowhere to be seen. Mirel Vesper did not sleep for 2 days. In the grey week that followed, when the widows had no coin for their husbands' burials, and the surviving boats lay smashed upon the rocks, and the whole village faced a winter with its men and its livelihood gone at once, help came to Brackenmere Hollow from the north. It came without ceremony. A steward arrived in a plain coach, a quiet man with careful eyes, and he carried a strong box and a set of instructions. Every widow's debt was paid. Every broken boat was to be rebuilt at no cost to the men, and rebuilt better than before. Mrs. Penhale, who had lost her only son, was given a pension for the rest of her days, and a girl to carry her baskets up the hill until the end of them. The families of the 6 drowned men were provided for every one, so that no child in that village would go hungry for the loss of a father. And when Tobias Cray went white, and asked the quiet steward who had sent such mercy, the steward said only that his master wished no thanks, and that his master's name was North Reach. Mirel heard it, and she sat down where she stood. He had not come himself. He had not sent for her, nor written her a single word, nor asked anything at all in return. He had simply reached out across the whole width of the kingdom and lifted the grief from a village that could do nothing for him, and then he had stepped back into the shadows and let them believe it was Providence. That was when she understood, not with her pride, which had always known the distance between them, but with her heart, which had never once been wrong about the man. She had refused a duke. She had not refused Edward. And Edward, whatever crest was painted on his carriage, was only ever the man who had folded her into his arms without asking a single question, and turned his shoulder to the crowd and told her that no one was looking at her now. She learned one thing more from the steward before he left. She had followed him to his coach, hardly daring, and asked him how his master had come to Brackenmere Hollow at all, so far from any road a duke would travel. Mr. Halloway considered her a moment, as though deciding what he was permitted to say. Then something in her face decided it for him. His Grace spent last summer at the far end of the coast, he said, settling a matter for a widow whose husband had drowned, much as these men have drowned. A kind woman. She wished to thank him, and having nothing to give a duke, she gave him counsel instead. She told him that if ever his heart grew too heavy to bear, he must go and find the ribbon girl of Brackenmere Hollow, whose smile, she swore, could mend a grief that no coin could touch. His Grace laughed at the time, but in the autumn, when his heart was very heavy indeed, he remembered it. Mr. Halloway paused. He did not stumble upon you at that pier by chance, Miss Vesper. He had been in the village 3 days, walking past your stall each morning, trying to find the courage to speak to a stranger he had crossed a kingdom to meet. He knew your name before you gave it to him. He knew where your stall stood before ever he set foot in the market. He was still searching for the words, on the night of the lanterns, when you saved him the trouble by throwing yourself into his arms. Mirelle pressed her hand to her mouth. All of it came back to her at once. The way he had repeated her name that first night, softly, like a thing confirmed. The way he had walked straight to her stall through the crush of the market without once lifting his head to look. She had thought nothing of it. Now every small, strange moment turned over in her memory and showed its true face. He had not come to see how the poor girl smiled. He had crossed a kingdom to be mended by her before he had ever seen her face. She wrote to him that same night. She was not a woman of many fine words, and she owned no crested paper, only the plain sheet she wrapped her ribbons in. She wrote only this, that she had been a fool, and that the distance between them had never once been of his making, and that if he still wished to be chosen, he had been from the very first, though she had been too proud and too frightened to say so. She wrapped the letter around the pale blue ribbon he had bought from her on the first market day, and she gave it to Mr. Halloway, and she waited, and she did not let herself hope. At Northreach, the letter reached him at his cold writing table, where the burned ends of a dozen unsent letters of his own still lay in the grate. He read it once, standing. He read it again, sitting. Halloway, who had carried a great many letters to a great many lords in his years of service, said afterward that he had never in his life seen a man's face change the way his master's changed over a single plain sheet of paper wrapped around a length of blue ribbon. The Duke did not ring for his carriage. He asked instead for his oldest coat, the chalk-dusted travelling coat his mother despised. And he was on the South Road before the ink of the reply he did not bother to write had time to dry. He came back on a clear, cold morning in the first week of the new year. There was no carriage this time, no livery, no crest. He came up the cliff path on foot, in his old ruined coat, with the chalk dust on his boots, exactly as he had come the first day. She saw him from her window, and she was down the stairs and out into the cold before she had thought to reach for her shawl. They met on the harbour wall, in the same place they had sat so many times. "I had a letter," he said. His voice was not quite steady. "From a ribbon seller. It is the finest thing anyone has ever written to me, and it was wrapped around a length of blue ribbon, and I have not let go of it since it reached my hand." "I meant every word," she said. "I know," he said. "That is why I came on foot." She began to weep, and he closed the small distance between them and folded her into his arms, the way he had that first night, calm and certain and entirely without fear. "Pretend to hug me," she whispered against his coat, and she felt him laugh, low and warm, the laugh of a man who has finally come home. "No," he said, "I am done pretending, so are you." Ambrose Thorne left the coast that spring, and he did not leave with his head high. When the village learned the whole of the truth, that the Duke had loved one of their own in earnest, that he had lifted their grief without asking for so much as a word of thanks, and that Thorne had spent that same winter spreading lies about the girl the Duke would marry and trying to buy her with her own ruin, the tide of the whole village turned against him in a single week. His father's customers took their trade elsewhere. The fishermen he had lorded over for years would no longer touch their caps to him. There is no man so friendless as the one who is found to have been cruel to a person the whole world has decided to love, and Ambrose learned it. He sold up and went inland before the wildflowers bloomed, and Brackenmere Hollow spoke his name no more. They were married in the spring of 1864, in the small stone church at the top of the cliff, with the whole of the village crowded in and spilling out the door. The Dowager Duchess did not attend. But she came in time, for it is difficult to go on refusing a woman who has quietly made a duke happier than his rank ever could, and harder still to argue with a village that would have marched on Northreach itself in her defence. Mirelle kept her basket of ribbons and sold them at the harbour market on fine days, because she said a woman ought to keep the trade her mother taught her, and no crest painted on any carriage door would make her forget where she had come from. 5 summers later, on a warm evening when the fields above the cliffs were silver with wildflowers, a small girl of 4 years ran laughing through the long grass with her fists full of blossoms. Her name was Elsie, and she had her mother's smile, and she had never in her short life been told that her father was a great man, only that he was a kind one. She ran to him now across the field, and he caught her up as easily as he had once caught up a widow's baskets, and swung her toward the reddening sky until she shrieked with joy. Nearby, Mirelle sat in the grass with a length of pale blue ribbon in her hands, half-stitched, watching them. Her husband carried their daughter over and set her down, breathless in her mother's lap, and lowered himself into the wildflowers beside them as though he had nowhere in the whole kingdom he would rather be. Which was the truth? "Tell it again," Elsie demanded, tugging at his sleeve. "How you met Mama." "Again?" he said gravely. "But you have heard it 100 times." "Again," said the little girl, for she was 4 years old and did not yet know her letters, and the only way a story could come to her was from her father's own mouth, and so she asked for it as often as she pleased. And so he told her, as he would tell her every summer of her childhood, the way it was already beginning to be told along the whole of that coast. How on a night of floating lanterns long ago, a poor and lovely girl had run to a quiet stranger and begged him to lie for her, and how the stranger had opened his arms without a single question, and how neither of them had ever truly let go. Elsie fell asleep before the end of it, as she always did, her fists still full of crushed wildflowers. Above them the last light left the sea, and out on the water, somewhere beyond the cliffs, it was very nearly time for the lanterns. If this story warmed your heart, stay with me a while longer, for the cliffs of Brackenmere Hollow hold many more tales still waiting to be told.